My name is Myra Sellers, and I'm 29 years old. For 9 summers straight, my parents dropped me at my aunt's door in June and picked me up in August, so my brother could have what my mom called family vacations. 9 years, 9 postcards, 9 versions of the same lesson. The day I got my high school diploma, my car was already packed. By midnight, I was unpacking in another state, and they didn't know which one. It took them 4 years to find me. And when they finally did, standing in the middle of my cafe 2,000 miles from Ohio, my mother looked at everything I'd built, and the first thing out of her mouth told me she hadn't driven all that way to apologize. She'd driven all that way to collect something. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally get to tell the loudest chapters of their lives. If stories about family, boundaries, and starting over speak to you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. Now let me take you back to the summer I turned 8, and the blue suitcase that started everything. The suitcase showed up on my bed on the last day of second grade. Sky blue, hard shell, little wheels. My mom presented it like a birthday gift. "Your very own big girl suitcase," she said, and she smiled the smile she used at church. I was 8. I thought suitcases meant airplanes, and airplanes meant Disney, because that's what they'd meant for my brother Danny the year before. Instead, 2 days later, we drove 5 hours north to Torch Bay, Michigan, where my Aunt Linda lived in a green house that smelled like coffee and lake water. My parents stayed for lunch. Then my dad carried the blue suitcase up the porch steps. My mom knelt down to my eye level, and she said the sentence I would hear for the rest of my childhood. "Strong kids don't make a fuss." She kissed my forehead, got in the car, and drove off toward the airport with Danny in the back seat, bound for Orlando. I stood on that porch and did exactly what I'd been told. I didn't make a fuss. I was good at it already, which should have worried somebody. Here's the detail that took me 20 years to say out loud. The trip to Orlando was booked in March. The suitcase was bought in April. Nobody told me anything until June. Which means the plan to send me away existed for 3 whole months before anyone thought I deserved a sentence about it. When people ask me now why I left the way I left, quietly, with the details worked out far in advance, I tell them the truth. I learned that method from my mother. She just never expected me to be the one holding the suitcase. Every summer after that had the same shape. The second week of June, the blue suitcase went into the trunk. 5 hours north. Lunch at Aunt Linda's table. The car pulling away with 3 people in it. And then, some week in July, a postcard would arrive, addressed to me in my mother's round, cheerful handwriting. Orlando the first year. Yellowstone. The Grand Canyon. San Diego. Niagara Falls. 9 summers. 9 cards. And every single one carried the same cheerful line on the back. "Wish you were here!" Exclamation point. Aunt Linda would hand the card over without a word, and later I'd catch her sliding it into an old shoebox on the pantry shelf, like she was keeping evidence for a trial nobody had scheduled yet. I used to read those cards the way other kids read cereal boxes, over and over, looking for a prize that wasn't there. It took me years to notice what was actually missing. Not once did a card say, "We miss you." Not once did one say, "Next year you'll come with us." The message was never an apology. It was a caption. "Look at the family, having its vacation." In September, my teachers would assign the essay every kid in Ohio writes, what I did on my summer break, and I'd write about Michigan and get a B+, and my mom would stick it on the refrigerator next to a photo of Danny on a jet ski. 2 versions of the same summer, held up by the same magnet. I stopped writing those essays honestly around the 4th year. Nobody noticed the difference, which told me more about my house than the postcards ever did. But the postcards weren't done with me. Years later, they'd end up mattering more than anything else I owned. To be fair to my parents, and I've spent years learning how to be exactly that fair and not 1 inch more, the story didn't start with a suitcase. It started with a hospital. When Danny was 6 and I was 2, he was diagnosed with leukemia. I have no memory of that time, but I grew up inside its architecture. 4 years of chemo, fundraisers at the church, a freezer full of casseroles from neighbors. My mother slept in a vinyl chair beside his bed so many nights that she could fold herself into it like a jackknife. My dad worked doubles at the printing plant to keep the insurance. And somewhere in that long emergency, my family reorganized itself into a shape that had a center, and the center was Danny. I understand it. A house on fire organizes around the fire. Danny got his remission in 2003. The bell, the balloons, the photo that still hangs in my parents' hallway. He was 10. I was 6. And that should have been the end of the emergency. Instead, it became the founding document. My parents came out of those years with a mission statement, making memories with Danny, because they had almost run out of chances to make any. And they came out with a belief about me that hardened like concrete. Myra is the easy one. Myra is healthy. Myra doesn't need anything. Here's the part I want you to sit with. The vacations without me didn't start during the illness. They started in 2005, 2 summers after he was cured. The emergency ended. The system it built did not. Nobody ever looked at the little girl carrying her own suitcase up the porch steps and asked whether the triage was still necessary. Triage was just how our family loved now. The summer I was 10, I made my case. The destination was the Grand Canyon, and I wanted to see it so badly my teeth hurt. I did it properly too, because even at 10 I was a planner. I packed my own bag a week early. I wrote a list titled, "Reasons I Should Come," in marker. And my top reason was that I had never seen anything a mile deep. I practiced my speech in the bathroom mirror. Then I stood in the kitchen and delivered it, list in hand, while my mom dried dishes and my dad leaned in the doorway, spinning his keys on one finger. My mom put the towel down. She knelt to my eye level, the way she always did for the hard ones, and her voice went soft as flannel. "This trip is for your brother, sweetheart. You understand. After everything he's been through." And then, when my chin did something I couldn't control, she tucked my hair behind my ear and finished me off with the family motto. "Strong kids don't make a fuss." My dad said nothing. That was his instrument, the whole orchestra of nothing. I went to my room and I did not make a fuss, and I heard the dishwasher start, and the TV, and the ordinary sounds of a house that had already moved on. But here's the sound I never got over. Around 9 that night, I heard the rumble of little wheels on hardwood. I came to the top of the stairs and looked down. My blue suitcase was already packed, already zipped, already parked by the front door. I hadn't touched it. Somebody had answered my speech hours before I ever gave it. I never asked to come along again. I had gotten my answer for all 9 years at once. Now, if this were a simpler story, the summers themselves would have been the punishment. They weren't. That's the complicated mercy at the middle of my childhood. Aunt Linda's greenhouse on the lake was the one place on earth where I was not the easy one, the quiet one, the one who didn't need anything. I was just Myra. Linda was my mom's older sister, widowed young, no kids, and she'd spent 30 years running a bakery in town before her hands got tired. She put me to work the first week I ever stayed with her, and I don't mean pretend work. Real dough. Real scale. Real customers' orders taped to the counter. She taught me pie crust the summer I was 9, standing behind me with her hands over mine on the rolling pin. "Cold hands, warm heart," she said. "Perfect for pastry." When I ruined a batch, she made me diagnose it like a doctor. Too much water, warm butter, and then we did it again. At her table, I got asked questions and my answers changed things. What we baked, what we planted, what we watched. I once heard her introduce me to a neighbor as my summer girl, and I walked around the rest of that day like I'd been knighted. One night when I was 11, she looked at me across a peach pie for a long moment and said, "In this house, you're not the quiet one. You're just Myra." Then she seemed to be about to say something else. She didn't say it. She got up and refilled my milk instead. All those summers, there were moments like that, sentences she started toward and turned back from, like a woman walking to the edge of a dock and deciding the water was too cold. The summer I was 12, I found out what was on the other side of those unfinished sentences. It was late, past 11, and I came downstairs for water. The kitchen light was on. Linda was at the table with the phone pressed to her ear, and I stopped in the dark hallway, because her voice had a sound I'd never heard in it before. Sharp. Almost pleading. Then let her stay with me for the school year, Carol. Carol is my mother. There was a long silence, long enough that I could hear the lake through the screen door. Then Linda again, and now the sharpness had gone cold. That's not how it would look? That's your answer? That's the whole answer? Another silence. No, I'm not trying to take anything from you. You can't take what someone's already said on the porch. I must have made a sound, or maybe the floor did it for me, because Linda turned and saw me standing there in my nightgown with my empty glass. Her whole face changed costumes in a second, back into summer aunt, and she said the school year was boring in Torch Bay anyway, nothing but slush, and walked me back up to bed, with her hand warm between my shoulders. We never spoke about it. I was 12. I understood only the temperature of it, that something had been asked, and something had been refused, and that the refusal had a reason my aunt found unforgivable. I filed it away the way kids file things, in a drawer that doesn't open until it's ready. It would be 10 more years before I learned what Linda had actually offered my mother that night, and what my mother had turned down, and the exact excuse she used to do it. Something changes in a girl the year she stops asking. My parents read it as maturity. Teachers called me self-sufficient, and my mother repeated the word at dinner parties like a trophy she'd won. What it actually was arithmetic. Around 14, I opened a spiral notebook and wrote a date on the first page, June 2015, the month I would turn 18 with a diploma in my hand, and under it I started a list that was really a countdown. I did the math on everything. What a room cost to rent in cities I'd never seen. What a used car cost. What a person could save in a year if she was careful and invisible. And invisible was my native language. The summer I was 17, I pulled off my first real operation. I asked to skip Michigan and stay home alone to work, and I watched my parents approve it in under a minute, no follow-up questions, while they packed for 2 weeks in Maine. So independent, my mother told the neighbors. The ease of that yes was its own diploma. I waited tables at a diner off Route 9 all summer, and every night I banded my tips and slid them into an envelope taped inside my closet, behind the winter coats. On the envelope I wrote a single word. Out. By graduation the envelope was an old shoebox, and the shoebox held $6,400, and not one person in my house had ever asked what I was saving for. They assumed college. Let them. Colleges send letters, and letters can be intercepted, so I'd already made my real plan the old way, at the public library, with a paper map. They thought I was saving for tuition. I was saving for a door. I chose my future in the Cedar Run Public Library, at a corner table, with an atlas and a legal pad. My requirements were cold and simple, far enough that nobody could drive there on a whim, cheap enough to live on diner wages while I found better ones. And it had to need bakers, because thanks to my aunt, baking was the one thing my hands knew how to do better than most grown adults. I flipped pages for weeks that spring. Then one afternoon I turned to a photo spread of northern Idaho, and there it was, a town wrapped around a lake so blue it looked painted. Coeur d'Alene. I sat there staring at that water, and I remember thinking it looked like Aunt Linda's lake. If Aunt Linda's lake had grown up and moved out too. That was the whole ceremony. No pro and con list. Some decisions you recognize instead of make. I found 3 cafes and a resort bakery in the town listings, wrote the addresses on my pad, and mailed job inquiries with a return address that belonged to my friend Jess, whose mailbox her parents never checked. I told no one, not even Linda, and leaving her out was the only part that felt like swallowing glass. But I knew my mother, and I knew that after I vanished, every person who loved me would get sat down at her kitchen table and questioned in that soft church voice. The only way to protect my aunt from having to lie for me was to make sure she had nothing to lie about. In May, an answer came back to Jess's mailbox. A cafe on the North Shore needed a dishwasher, starting summer. It paid almost nothing. I read it 4 times and slept like a queen. Graduation was the second Saturday of June 2015 on the football field, folding chairs on the grass. I was up before 5 that morning, and by 1:30 my Honda, $1,900 of my own tip money, was packed in the driveway. The blue suitcase in the trunk, the shoebox of cash under the spare tire. And beside it, one thing nobody would have predicted. The other shoebox. The one with 9 postcards. Which I had quietly taken from Linda's pantry the summer before. Don't ask me why I brought them. At 18, I called them evidence. It took me years to admit they were a wound I wasn't done pressing. My parents did come to graduation. I want to be accurate about that, because accuracy is the only revenge I've ever fully trusted. They came, they sat, and 40 minutes in, during the D's, my mother leaned over and whispered that they had to slip out early, because Danny's new job in Columbus was throwing a signing dinner and traffic on the interstate gets ugly. She squeezed my wrist. So proud, she said. When my row finally stood and they called Myra Ann Sellers, I walked the stage and shook a stranger's hand and looked out at 2 empty folding chairs with programs on the seats. And here's the strange thing. It didn't even hurt in the usual way. It felt like a receipt. Like the universe itemizing, one last time, exactly what I was to them, so I could leave with the math done. My whole childhood I'd wondered if my plan made me the villain of the family. They left my graduation early, and I stopped wondering. That night I ate dinner with them, said I was tired, went upstairs, and at 4 in the morning, I left. If you've ever been the one who waited in the hallway while the family photo got taken, I want you to know I see you. Tell me in the comments where you were the summer you turned 10. I read every single one. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because what my parents did when they finally found me is a whole other story, and we're getting there. I left a note on the kitchen table, weighted down with the sugar bowl so it couldn't be mistaken for trash. I'd drafted it maybe 30 times over the winter, and every draft got shorter, because everything true I had to say kept collapsing into fewer words. The final version said, "I'm safe. I'm an adult. Please don't look for me." I signed it M, the way Linda always shortened me, which was either a clue or a goodbye, and I've never decided which. Then I backed out of the driveway with my headlights off, and didn't turn them on until the end of the street. 3 days, 2,000 miles. I slept twice in the Honda in Walmart parking lots, doors locked, seat tilted back, shoebox of cash riding under the spare tire like a heartbeat. Somewhere in Montana, I pulled over at a gas station, took my phone apart, and swapped in a prepaid SIM I'd bought with cash in Ohio. My old number, the one my mother had, died in a trash can outside Missoula. On the evening of the 3rd day, I came over a rise on the interstate, and the whole town of Coeur d'Alene opened up below me, pines going down to that impossible blue water, and I had to grip the wheel because my hands wanted to shake, and I didn't have the spare attention to let them. 18 years old, everything I owned in a hatchback. Nobody in the world knew where I was, and I mean, nobody. You'd think that would feel like falling. It felt like the first full breath I'd taken since I was 8. 11 days later, a police officer knocked on my motel room door, and I opened it knowing exactly who had sent him. Let me hold the officer for one beat, because to understand what happened at that door, you need to see the life I was building behind it. The cafe that hired me sat on the North Shore and was called the Lake Shore. 40 years old, pine floors gone soft as soap, and it belonged to a woman named Rosa Delgado, who was 64 then, and ran her kitchen like a small navy. I washed dishes 10 hours a day and my hands cracked, and I loved it the way you love anything that's entirely yours. I found a studio apartment over a garage for $300 a month, and when the baseboard heater died my first October, I did not call the landlord. I want you to notice that, because it took me years to. I watched repair videos at the library, bought a thermal fuse for $6, and fixed it myself with the breaker off and my tongue between my teeth. I told myself that was thrift. It wasn't. It was doctrine. Somewhere in 9 summers I had absorbed the family catechism. Needing things is a tax other people pay, and I would sooner have slept cold than knocked on a door. Remember that about me. It's the flaw this whole story eventually turns on. The week before Thanksgiving, the cafe's baker sprained her wrist, and Rosa found me at the sinks. "Anybody back there bake?" she asked the kitchen at large. My hand was up before my shyness could vote. She stood over me while I rolled out a test crust, arms crossed, and I did it the way I'd done it 100 times in a greenhouse in Michigan. Rosa took one bite, looked at me differently, and asked where I learned. "My aunt," I said. "Then your aunt raised a baker?" Rosa said, and walked off. I stood there over that pie like it was a passport. The officer at my motel door, back in those first 11 days, was younger than I expected and visibly bored, which turned out to be the best thing he could have been. My mother had filed a missing person report in Ohio the day after graduation. That report followed the trail of my first debit card swipe, a tank of gas I'd paid electronically before I got smart, and it ended with a welfare check at my door. I handed him my driver's license and my brand new lease. He looked at both, looked at me, and asked the only question the law actually cares about. "Are you here of your own free will, ma'am?" I said yes. He had me sign a form confirming I was a voluntary missing adult, and then he explained, in the tone of a man reciting a bus schedule, exactly how it works. "Your family will be notified that you've been located and that you're safe. They will not be told where you are. That's your right. Have a good night." And that was the whole miracle. The system my mother thought would fetch me home instead drew a legal curtain between us, and all her church voice charm couldn't part it, because the curtain doesn't negotiate. Before I changed numbers, one last voicemail had gotten through from her. I stood in that motel room and played it once. "Myra, this is very dramatic, honey. We raised you better than this. Strong kids don't make AA." And I deleted it right there, mid-word, and the room went quiet. It's the only time in my life I ever got to finish that sentence for her. For the next 4 years, that half a sentence was the last sound my mother's voice made in my life. 2 full years into Idaho, the blue suitcase was still packed. I want to be honest about what that means. I had an apartment, a job I was good at, a lease with my name on it, and a suitcase by the closet door that I had never fully unpacked, like some part of me was still standing on a porch in Michigan waiting for a car to come back. One Sunday night in my 3rd October, I finally opened it flat on the floor to empty it for good, and there at the bottom was the shoebox. 9 postcards. Orlando to Niagara, in order, my mother's round handwriting grinning up at me. "Wish you were here." I carried the box out back behind the cafe, where Rosa keeps a steel burn barrel, and I stood there with a lighter in my fist for a long time. Then I went back inside. Not because I forgave anything, because burning them felt like one more disappearance, and I was tired of solving things by vanishing. Instead, I sat at the counter after close with a pen, and I turned each card over, and under my mother's caption I wrote what that summer had actually been. Summer 3, I taught myself to swim because no one was there to watch me do it. Summer 5, I stopped crying at drop-off, and everyone praised me for it. Summer 8, Linda asked me what I wanted for once, and I couldn't answer, because nobody had ever asked the question. 9 cards, 2 handwritings, 2 versions of one childhood. I put the box on the shelf above my stove, where a person keeps things she actually intends to look at. I told myself I kept them as receipts. The truth is, some part of me was still waiting for somebody to ask to read the other side. By my 3rd year, I was the Lakeshore's baker, and more I was running the kitchen when Rosa's knuckles had their bad mornings, which was more mornings than she'd admit. She was 66 by then. One February afternoon she sat me down with 2 coffees and laid it out plain, the way she did everything. She wanted to retire while her hips still let her garden. The cafe was worth about $180,000 with the equipment. She'd had offers, one from a chain, one from a man who used the words vape lounge in her dining room and was lucky to leave alive. "I'm not selling 40 years to someone who'll gut it," she said. "I'd rather sell it slow to someone who'll love it." Then she looked at me in a way that made the back of my neck warm. "40,000 down," she said. "I'd carry the rest myself, monthly, seller financing, like they did it in the old days, for someone I trust." She let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. I went home that night and taped a sheet of graph paper inside my closet door, and at the top I wrote $40,000, and under it, in pencil, the number I had. 23,400. For the next year and a half that sheet was my religion. Tips. Overtime, no streaming, boots resoled instead of replaced. 26, 31, 38. People talk about buying a business. That's not what this was. This was the first thing I had ever wanted out loud at full volume, where losing it could actually hurt me. A place with my name on the deed, in a town I chose, where nobody could ever again decide which members of the household counted as the family. Rosa only made one condition. "Don't disappear on me," she said. I laughed. She didn't. I need to tell you about the one thread I never cut, because without it, nothing at the end of this story makes sense. Every year, in the second week of June, I bought one postcard of Lake Coeur d'Alene, the tourist kind, all that painted-looking blue. No return address, no signature, no town visible in the picture. I checked every time. On the back, where a message goes, I drew one small pie with a crimped crust, the way you'd doodle it on a napkin, and I mailed it to a greenhouse in Torch Bay, Michigan. The first June, I stood at the mailbox for 10 minutes before I let it drop, running the risks like a bank auditor. Linda would know my mother's questions were coming. Linda would have to hold this secret across a family that considered her the odd sister already. It wasn't a small thing I was asking of a woman I wasn't even speaking to. I dropped it anyway, because the alternative was letting her spend jeunesse wondering if I was alive. She never wrote back, since she had no address to write to. But the following summer, a regular at the cafe mentioned her cousin had visited from Michigan, and I felt the two states touch for half a second, and I went in the walk-in cooler and breathed until it passed. 4 postcards over 4 years, a pie doodle instead of a name. That was our entire correspondence. And my aunt read it exactly right. She of all people knew how much a person can say on the back of a postcard. What I didn't know, and wouldn't learn until everything broke open, was what keeping that secret quiet was costing her at every holiday table in Ohio. My safety had a price. She just never sent me the bill. The article was Rosa's idea, and I want that on the record, because for 4 years the whole shape of my life had one rule at the bottom of it: stay small, stay unfindable. A writer from North Idaho Living was doing a piece on Laketown institutions, and she'd heard about our huckleberry pie, and Rosa, who had never met a spotlight she didn't shove somebody else into, volunteered me. The writer wanted the baker's name. She wanted a photo by the ovens. I stood in the kitchen with my hands in a towel, while every alarm I owned went off at once. And then I looked around, at the slow winter that was coming, at Rosa's arthritis, at the graph paper number that grew or didn't grow depending on how many strangers found this room, and I did the math I'd been avoiding. The cafe needed to be found. You can't run a business on a witness protection heart. So I said yes. I stood by the ovens in a clean apron and smiled, and 3 weeks later, there it was. The huckleberry pie worth crossing the lake for. My name in print, Myra Sellers, first time in my adult life. My face above the fold of a paper I'd never once been afraid of, because who in Ohio reads North Idaho Living? For about 2 weeks I was proud in a way that felt like walking on a new floor, testing every board. Then the paper posted the piece on its website, and websites don't have city limits. A woman I barely remembered, a second cousin of my mother's from Cedar Run, left a comment under the photo, 11 days after it went up. One short comment, with a question mark. Isn't this Carol's girl? It was a Tuesday in late October 2019, the dead hour between breakfast and lunch, and I was behind the counter boxing an order when the bell over the door rang. I said we'd be right with you before I looked up. Then I looked up. My mother was standing in the middle of my cafe, 4 years and 2,000 miles, and there she was between table 6 and the pastry case, in her good wool coat, her hair grayer than the version I'd been arguing with in my head all this time. Behind her, holding the door the way he held every door of my childhood, silently, was my dad. He looked smaller, and his free hand, down at his side, was trembling. a fine, constant shiver like a phone on silent, and some cold clinical part of me noted it and filed it before my thoughts could even form a word. Nobody moved. The espresso machine hissed. I watched my mother take it all in with one slow sweep of the room she was so good at. The chalk menu with my pie list, the framed article by the register, the apron with the Lakeshore logo tied twice around my waist because it was cut for someone bigger. 4 years. Whatever came out of her mouth first, I remember thinking, would tell me everything, the way a first sentence always had in our family. She finished her inspection. She looked at me, at my whole standing, solvent, unfussed life, and she pressed her lips together in that way that always came before the church smile, and she said, "So this is what you left your family for?" That's when I knew they hadn't driven 2 days for an apology. They'd driven 2 days for a pickup. I poured them coffee. I want you to understand why. Because it wasn't weakness. A woman who owns her ground can afford to pour coffee on it. They sat at the counter like customers, and for 20 minutes my mother gave me the authorized history of my childhood, and I listened to it the way you'd listen to a tour guide describe your own house. In her version, I'd had 9 wonderful summers with my aunt, whom I adored. In her version, they had given me independence, the greatest gift. Look how well it turned out. Look at this cafe. In her version, my disappearance was a phase, a cruelty she had borne with grace, and we needn't relitigate it now that I'd gotten it out of my system. Here's what frightened me, truly. She wasn't lying. You can hear lying. My mother believed every syllable, the way you believe a road you've driven for 40 years. Somewhere across those decades, she had built a version of our family where every choice was love, and she lived in it the way we all lived in that house, comfortably and without ever checking the basement. My dad said almost nothing, which was its own kind of fluency. His finger tapped the counter, an uneven little rhythm he didn't seem to know about. Twice I caught him looking at the framed article, at my name in it, with an expression I had no file for. Finally, I asked the question 4 years had sharpened. Why did it take so long to find me, if any of this mattered? And my dad, my silent dad, opened his mouth for the first time since the door. "I did," he said. Barely a breath in, my mother's hand landed on his sleeve, light as a napkin, and he stopped. Then my mother folded her hands on my counter and got to the business of the trip. "Your father has Parkinson's," she said. "Diagnosed in the spring. Early stage, the tremor, the stiffness. You've seen his hand." She said it the way you'd report weather, and then she let the silence do a lap. And I stood there holding a coffee pot while the word Parkinson's rearranged the man by the window into someone I was going to lose twice. He looked at me and gave me a small, apologetic shrug, as if the disease were a guest he'd invited by accident. And then my mother kept going, because the diagnosis was not the point of the sentence, it was the runway. "Danny can't be expected to manage this," she said. "He has the children, the career. You understand." The words landed in the exact grooves 9 summers had carved. Someone's needs, and then me, the one without any. She reached across my counter and took my wrist, the same squeeze as graduation, and she said it. The sentence she had crossed 6 states to deliver. "You've always been the strong one, Myra. It's time to come home." Home for Thanksgiving, she meant, to start. "We'll tell everyone together. A family announcement." She was already at the guest list. I looked down at her hand on my wrist, French manicure, her mother's ring, and the strangest thing happened. I felt the exact weight of it, and it weighed what a baggage tag weighs. 4 years, 2,000 miles, a legal curtain, a new name on a lease, a life built plank by plank with my own cracked hands, and the first full sentence my mother had for me was a job assignment. The vacancy for the strong one had reopened, and I was being recalled. I took my wrist back, gently, the way you take a knife from a child. I said no. Not a speech, not a trembling manifesto, just the single word. And then, because the lunch crowd was 20 minutes out, I told them the kitchen needed me, and they should try the huckleberry before the drive back. My mother's face did something complicated and settled on wounded dignity, her home parish. On the sidewalk, through the glass, I watched her reorganize my dad toward the car, and he looked back at me once, and I did not wave. And neither did he. And somehow, that was the most honest exchange the three of us had managed all morning. That night, my phone rang from an Ohio number I didn't know. Danny. My mother had given him the number she'd demanded from me at the counter, which I'd surrendered to end the visit. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. And I want to be fair to my brother the way I promised to be fair to everyone. Exactly, and no more. He didn't open with the family script. He opened with a question, quiet and off balance. Was it true you hated going to Aunt Linda's? And I said I never hated Linda's. I hated what it meant. And I told him what it meant. All of it. The suitcase in April. The porch. The postcards. The line went so quiet I checked the screen. Then my brother, 26 years old, said, "Mom told me you loved it there. My whole life. I believed her." His voice cracked on the last of it. He didn't ask me to come home and nurse anybody. He asked one thing only. Don't disappear on me again. After we hung up, I sat a long time looking at a shoebox on the shelf above my stove. Here's the part nobody warns you about. Cutting contact is one decision, but staying gone is a decision you make every single morning. If you've ever had to choose between your peace and your family's version of you, comment, "I chose me" below, so the next person scrolling knows she's not the only one. And stay with me, because the dinner that changed everything is coming. I called Linda the next night, and the moment she heard my voice she knew something had happened, because our whole ritual was one wordless postcard a year, and now here I was, speaking. "They found me," I said, and told her about the cafe, the coffee, the recall notice. She was quiet for a moment. Then my aunt took a breath and paid off a debt that was 10 years past due. "You were 12, she said. "You came downstairs for water. I know you heard some of it. Here's the rest." That summer, she had offered to take me for the school year. Not a visit. Enrolled in Torch Bay, my own room. Her paying for everything. My parents free to orbit Danny full-time. Me raised in a house where somebody actually looked up when I entered a room. She had the paperwork half-drafted. She'd rehearsed it for weeks before she dialed. And my mother listened to the whole offer. All of it. And turned it down flat. And the reason she gave was not that she would miss me. The reason, word for word after all these years, was, that's not how it would look. A daughter shipped off for good. People would ask questions. A daughter loaned out for summers. That was just cousins' camp. That was wholesome. 9 summers was the maximum my absence could weigh while the family photo still framed upright. My childhood had been portioned out to the exact limit of appearances, like a diet. I stood in my kitchen in Idaho holding the phone, doing the one piece of arithmetic I'd never let myself do. It was never thoughtlessness, it was policy. Then Linda said the other thing. "I should have fought harder, sweetheart. Come to Thanksgiving with me, not for them. So you never again have to wonder who you'd be in that room." I didn't sleep much for 3 nights. I'd like to tell you the debate was about my parents, but it was mostly about a sheet of graph paper. 38,700. That's where the number stood. $700 shy of shaking Rosa's hand, after 4 years of Risoled boots. Going back to Ohio wasn't a plane ticket, it was a breach in the whole hull of my life, and I knew myself well enough to know why it terrified me. If that house got its hooks back into me, the strong one would do what the strong one does. Absorb, accommodate, disappear in place, which is the one kind of disappearing I hadn't tried yet. On the 4th morning, I did the thing I'd never done in my adult life. I asked for help, out loud, with the whole truth attached. I sat Rosa down at her own corner table before open, and I told her everything. Ohio, the summers, the suitcase, my father's hand, the number on the graph paper, and what I was afraid Thanksgiving might cost me, in money and in nerve. She heard me all the way out, arms crossed. Then she said, "The cafe's been here 40 years. It can wait 3 weeks." And then, because Rosa has never once missed the center of a target, she added, "Can you?" I booked the flight that afternoon, Spokane to Columbus, the day before Thanksgiving. And then I did something I couldn't fully explain at the time. I got the blue suitcase out from under the bed and packed it for the trip. 4 years it had sat there empty, retired. If I was walking back into that house, I was walking in with the luggage they'd taught me on. Call it a witness. Some evidence you carry, some evidence carries you. Linda drove down from Michigan and met me at the Columbus airport, and the sight of her in arrivals, gray now, scanning heads exactly the way she used to scan the beach for me, undid more of my composure than the whole flight had. We got a motel by the interstate. I want that detail noticed. 2 grown women with family in town, and we got a motel, because a boundary you can't walk out of isn't a boundary, it's a guest room. That evening we stopped by the house, a courtesy call before the main event, and my childhood home performed an autopsy on itself for me, room by room. The hallway wall was Danny in every size: Little League, prom, remission bell, wedding, a museum with one wing. I appear twice, both times in class composites, one face among 24. My old bedroom is a yoga studio now. My mother said it brightly, as if delivering good news about real estate. And then, on the top of the kitchen hutch, I saw the other shoebox. Her postcards. The same 9 trips. The duplicates she'd kept, fanned in a wicker basket like potpourri. Curated. Displayed. Our family kept 2 archives of the same 9 summers, hers in a basket for company to admire, mine above a stove in Idaho with the truth inked on the backs. Same cards. Different museums. My dad walked me out to the car when we left. Under the porch light, the same porch light, he pressed a piece of paper into my hand, folded down small, the way men of his generation fold anything they can't say. His hand shook against mine, from the disease or the moment I couldn't tell. "Read it after," was all he managed. I put it in my coat pocket, and it sat there all night, ticking. Thanksgiving arrived camera ready, because my mother produces holidays the way networks produce finales. 12 for dinner. Both leaves in the table, the good china with the gold rims, napkins folded into swans, which I have never seen in any other home in America. The guest list was the full repertory cast: my grandmother's brother Ray and his wife, 2 of my mother's cousins, the neighbors Carol collects, and Danny's family, his wife Kate, and their daughter Ellie, who is 3, and was orbiting the dessert table like a small moon. I came with Linda, and I came carrying a huckleberry pie in a white box, and if you think that pie was just dessert, you haven't been listening. My hands made it. Linda's hands taught my hands, and it was about to sit in the center of Carol's table, which meant that for one afternoon, all 3 of my worlds would be stacked on the same trivet. My mother met us at the door with the church smile at full wattage and cast the whole room in one breath. There she is, our world traveler. Isn't she thin? Ellie hid behind Kate's leg and studied me, this ant-shaped stranger. My dad sat at the head of the table, and I watched the tremor negotiate with the water glasses, and looked away, because he caught me looking. It went, honestly, fine. Fine, like glasses fine. Small talk, casserole logistics, Ray's opinions about interstate construction. Then the turkey landed and the potatoes went around, and my mother stood up at her end of the table and picked up her wine glass and dinged it with a spoon. Ding, 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 and said, "Before we eat, I have some wonderful news to share with the family." Here's the thing about my mother and me. We'd both come to that table with an announcement. She just assumed hers was the only one. My mother stood at the head of that table like a woman who had rehearsed in the shower, and she delivered the news in 2 movements. First, the minor key. As some of you know, Frank has been having some health trouble, and the doctors have confirmed it's Parkinson's. The table did what tables do: the soft gasp, Ray's wife's hand to her collarbone, murmurs of "Oh Frank, oh Carol." My dad studied his plate through all of it like a man being discussed at his own funeral, and then my mother lifted her chin and modulated into the major key, the part she'd driven 2,000 miles to set up. "But here's the wonderful news," she said. "Myra is moving home to help take care of her father." She let it land, and then she garnished it. She's always been the strong one." The room burst into exactly the response she had catered. Ray said "atta girl" and raised his beer. One of the cousins actually clapped. 3 little pats. The neighbor woman dabbed her eye with a swan napkin and said, "What a good daughter," and my mother received it all with a slow nod, the humble conductor, while her hand came to rest on my shoulder. And I understood I was the announcement the way the turkey was the centerpiece. I looked around that table, at 12 faces glowing at a sentence about my life that had never once been said to my face as a question, and the déjà vu was so precise it was almost chemical. A trip booked in March, a suitcase bought in April, a daughter informed in June. 15 years later, the same machine, and the machine had never even considered that the part might decline. Then, into the applause, little Ellie's voice rose from her booster seat, clear as a dinner bell, with the one question nobody in that room could survive. She pointed a fork at me and asked her mother, "Who is that lady?" Kate shushed her, cheeks going red. But the question just hung there over the swans, because out of the mouths of babes, that was the actual state of the family. The strong one was a stranger to the newest member of it. My brother stared at his plate. My father looked up at me, and I placed my napkin beside my plate, and I stood. Here's what I had learned in 4 years of running a small business. You never outshout the room. You lower your voice until the room has to come to you. I stood there until the last chuckle died on its own, and then I spoke at the volume you'd use to read a bedtime story. "You're right, Mom," I said. "I never made a fuss. I made a life." And because I finally had the floor at that table, 22 years into being furniture at it, I kept my sentences short, and I placed them like settings. "I'm not moving home," I said. Ray started to speak and thought better of it. "But nobody in this family is going to say I left my father shaking at a table, so here is what is going to happen instead." I told them I had spent the last week on the phone with a home care agency in Columbus, licensed, bonded, the one the neurologist's office recommends. 3 mornings a week to start, scaling as Dad needs it. The invoices come to me in Idaho, it's already scheduled. The first nurse comes Monday. I did not tell them what it cost. I'll tell you because you've earned the arithmetic. It was the graph paper. It was the down payment. Or most of it. The boots resoled and the streaming never ordered. 4.5 years of living small, a number I could recite in my sleep. Redirected in one phone call. Rosa's handshake would have to wait, and the waiting had no end date I could see. My mother's face went through its repertoire, wounded, then parliamentary. She tried the gavel. "After everything this family has given you," she began. I didn't raise my voice at all. "You gave me a suitcase, Mom. Every June." It came out so quiet the table leaned in, and then the sentence finished detonating, and nobody's fork moved. I watched Ray's wife look at my mother, and I watched the look not bounce off. And that was new. Second, I said, "I'll visit Dad twice a year, and I'll call him Sundays. I come as a guest. Invited, not assigned. And third, my name is retired from family announcements. Nothing about my life gets stood up and told to a table again unless I'm the one standing. That's the whole deal. It doesn't have a negotiation in it." My mother set down her wine glass with a click and went to her last resort, the oldest exit on the property. "If you walk out of this house," she said, "don't bother coming back." And there it was, the full price, invoiced in front of witnesses. The daughter who funds the nurse, twice-a-year guest becomes, in the authorized version, the girl who abandoned her sick father at Thanksgiving. I knew the story she'd tell before the door even shut. I paid it anyway. I looked at my mother and said, "That house key hasn't fit me since I was 8. And then my father pushed back his chair and gripped the table and stood, shaking, and the whole room stopped breathing. But before my dad could get a word up out of his chest, my mother broke. Not into tears. My mother doesn't do tears in front of the good china. She broke off script, which for her is far more naked. She was still holding the edge of the table, and she said, to no one in particular, in a voice I had never heard her use, "I was 12. The table turned to her. "I was 12, she said again, "when your grandmother's legs went." Linda was 18 and already gone, working 2 states away. Somebody had to do the cooking, the washing, the lifting, the getting her to the toilet at 2 in the morning, and it was me. It was always me, and nobody ever asked me either. She stopped. One beat too late. The way you stop when you hear your own voice say the thing you've spent 50 years not saying. Nobody ever asked me either. There it was. The whole machine, the suitcase, the postcards, the strong one, all of it, wasn't something my mother invented. It was something she inherited, the way you inherit a table. She had been the girl at the sink, and she had survived it by deciding that being unasked was a badge, and she had pinned that badge on her own daughter with pride, the only way she knew to say "you're like me." For one long second I saw her at 12, at a stove too tall for her, and I felt the near miss of loving her the way you love someone you might have been. Linda spoke from the end of the table, very softly, to her sister across 50 years. "Carol. She's not you. Let her go." My mother looked at me, and I did the only thing left that was both true and kind. "I know, Mom," I said. "Nobody asked you. That's why I'm stopping this. So nobody at this table ever has to be asked. They just get to belong." She didn't answer. She sat down, very straight, staring at the swans, chain, meat bolt cutters. Then I turned to the one person who was still standing. My father. My dad stood at the head of the table with both hands on the wood, tremor running through the cider glasses, and everyone waited for a speech that was never coming, because 40 years at a printing press teaches a man that words are something other people send out to be said. He looked at me and said, "Read it, Mai." So I did, right there, standing at the table, because he'd earned witnesses, and so had I. I unfolded the paper from my coat pocket. It was a photocopy of an invoice, dated August 2016, 14 months after I left. Kestrel Investigations, Columbus, Ohio. Retainer, skip trace, locate attempt. Marked at the bottom in red, no result. Case closed at client request. And underneath, in my father's up-and-down pressman's handwriting, gone shaky now at the tails, a note he must have written this week. Found nothing. Your mother said to stop. She'll come back when she needs us. I stopped. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. Dad. I stood there holding 14 months of my father looking for me. It didn't fix anything. He'd hired a man instead of raising his voice, and when the man found nothing, he'd folded like he always folded. He knew it too. That's what the paper was. A confession that he'd quit, from the only person at that table honest enough to put his failure in writing. But here's what it also was. Proof that once, before the story got rewritten, somebody in that house had looked. I folded it back up small, the way he folds things, and I put it in my pocket for keeps. Then I stepped around the table and put my hand over his shaking one and said, "The nurse starts Monday, Dad. And when you're ready to fly out and visit Idaho, I will teach you to roll a crust." Linda got our coats. On the porch, on the exact boards where a blue suitcase used to wait every June, I finally finished the sentence I'd been writing since I was 8. It took them 4 years to find me. It took me 9 summers to stop waiting to be found. Here's the ledger, 1 year on, because I promised you accuracy, not a bow. The nurse's name is Patrice, and she started that Monday. My dad sends me photos now from his flip phone, terrible ones, half thumb, and the first was a selfie of him and Patrice both frowning into the lens like hostages, captioned, "She counts my pills like your mother counts silverware." It's the longest joke he's made in years. We talk Sundays, short calls. They're enough, and enough is a fortune where I come from. My mother and I have not spoken. At Christmas a card arrived in Idaho, tasteful, no letter inside, signed in her round hand, Mom. Not sorry, not love. Just the title she isn't ready to lose. Some doors don't slam in this life. Some just settle closed. Rosa and I signed in March. When the number came up short, she waved her hand and redrew the note herself. 25 down instead of 40. The balance folded into the monthly. 4 more years on the term. It'll cost me more in the long run, and I signed it smiling, because it turns out a dream with a lien on it is still a dream. There's a new line of paint on the cafe door glass, under Rosa's name. Small, because I asked for small. M. Sellers, proprietor. In July, a rental car pulled in off the lake road, and my brother got out, and then unbuckled his daughter. They stayed 4 days. Ellie ate huckleberry pie with both hands and renamed me Aunt Pie, which I have legally accepted. And on the last morning, Danny stood a long time at the shelf above my stove, where the shoebox sits open now, and he read the backs of all 9 postcards, his mother's handwriting on one side, his sister's on the other. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he squared the cards, put them back, and said, "I'm sorry I never turned the cards over." That's the whole apology I got from Ohio that year. It was also the only one that was ever going to matter. Which brings us to the next Thanksgiving, the first one at my cafe. We pushed every table in the lakeshore into one long line, kitchen to window, and we fed whoever had nowhere better to be. Staff, regulars, the new dishwasher whose family is in Guatemala, a widower named Gus who tips in firewood, 22 chairs, no swans, no announcements. Rosa said grace in 2 languages. Linda flew out, first plane she'd boarded in a decade, and I put her at the head of the table, because every kingdom should watch its true queen eat. Before pie, I handed her a postcard. Lake Coeur d'Alene on the front, that impossible painted blue. On the back, in my handwriting, the old familiar greeting and its exclamation point. "Wish you were here." She read it, and laughed, and then didn't laugh, and looked down the whole steaming length of that table to the window and the real lake beyond it. And for the first time in my life, the person the card was meant for was already in the room. The blue suitcase lives on top of the pantry hutch now. It holds the holiday tablecloths. Twice a year I take it down, shake out the linens, and set the longest table in town with luggage that was supposed to teach me to leave quietly. As for what I learned, it fits in one sentence. Family isn't who shares your blood or your last name. It's the people who never need to send a postcard, because they never let you be the one who's missing. That's my story. 9 summers, 1 blue suitcase, and a table with my name on the door. If this reminded you of the summers you spent being the strong one, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs their own longest table. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.